Greetings, NABJ family. I know you're eager to join today's webinar, but let me steal just a few seconds of your time. According to a recent NABJ survey, more than 50% of our members have either lost their jobs, been furloughed, taken pay cuts, or had their hours cut. These are smart, dedicated Black journalists. This is our family. NABJ just launched a COVID-19 relief fund to help members facing economic hardship. If you can, we're asking you to donate so we can offer as many grants as possible. But if you need the help, don't hesitate to apply. You'll find the link at nabj.org. Enjoy your webinar. Thank you for listening.
Good evening, NABJ. My name is Tia Mitchell, and I'm the chair of our political task force. And we thank you guys so much for joining us for our webinar today, which is all about covering elections during the coronavirus pandemic. We know as journalists, even if your full-time beat isn't political journalism, that you still might be assigned to cover elections, whether it's on the national or the local level. So we want to give you some tools and tricks. So bear with me, I'm going to pull up our presentation. And hopefully everyone can see our presentation. And we're going to get started. So our panelists, we have three great panelists, and they represent three different types of political reporting. So we have Lecrae Mitchell, who is the campaign reporter for CBS News. We have Darren Sands, who's a freelance political journalist, most recently with BuzzFeed. And he knows all about the print side and the digital side. And then we have Lynn Hatter, who is the news director at WFSU, Florida Public Media. So she knows all about the radio side. So first, if our webinar people can help us by launching the poll, and we'll start there. So we just wanted to give a little bit of time to let you guys respond to the poll, and that'll help us understand who's here, and so that we, as we go through the presentation, can make sure we're responding to who's here and what you guys are going to be covering. We know we have some students, so us panelists, the panelists will be keeping in mind the students as well. So do we have the poll results? It looks like it's still in progress. I don't want to start screen sharing until we can see the poll results. And also, if you guys have any questions as we go along, don't hesitate to just ask the questions as they come up. You can use the chat feature. So the poll results are, it looks like 1 in 10, 11% are going to be focused on national races. Whereas, yeah, we can stop the poll now. It looks like so far about 1 in 10, 11% are going to be focused on national races. So we will be talking today about how to localize national races. And then 22% said you guys are going to be covering your local races, which is great. You're going to hear some tools today about how to cover local races. So I'm going to pull the presentation back up, and then I'm going to let the panelists take over. So give me 1 second to pull the presentation back up. But again, if you guys have questions, please don't hesitate to put it in the Q&A if you want to do it that way, or you can do it in the chat box, and our panelists will be paying attention. And yeah, so now that we've got that, like we said, this is just a quick overview of what we're going to be talking about. And thank you for joining us, and let's get started by talking about tools of the trade. Go ahead and take it away, Lynn.
Hey everybody, good evening. I hope everyone can hear me okay. And if I start to fade out, I promise I didn't hang up on you guys. I'm in Tallahassee, Florida, home of the almost daily thunderstorm, and it is storm season. So I just want to issue that disclaimer early on in case for some reason I dip out. I want to talk a little bit about some really handy tools that come in right now. Obviously, a lot of us, if you're like me, you're homebound, you're doing a lot of work on GoToMeeting, Skype, Teams, Zoom, pretty much everything aside from sort of in-person reporting. And so that means that we have to get a little bit crafty with our trade. I work in audio, some great resources for sort of reporting from home and reporting from remotely do involve the use of Skype, Zoom, and GoToMeeting. I don't know if everybody is aware, but you can record your interviews from pretty much all of these platforms. And you can use those recordings if you work in audio. You can basically take the audio out, still have the actual physical reporting. If you work in television, these are excellent opportunities to still have sort of one-on-ones with people. So I really encourage everybody to be using Skype, using Zoom, using GoToMeeting. My team, we use a lot of Teams, Microsoft, for like one-on-one interactions with each other. All of these are excellent. And if you're not familiar with them, I would really suggest becoming acquainted quickly, because these are also the same tools that the campaigns are using. You're probably seeing a lot of virtual town halls right now, a lot of candidates trying to figure out how to do outreach, and they're sort of using these tools. So get yourself acquainted and acclimated, and know that you can still use these products too to enhance your reporting. Another tool that comes in really handy, especially if you're an audio person, is Otter AI. And I want to talk a little bit about this app because it can do live transcriptions, which is something I know a lot of us are in need of. Now, Otter AI is not perfect, but Otter AI is free. And if you are a journalist, you probably do indeed love the word free. This is a great tool to be using. It converts audio to text. It'll give you pretty much a verbatim readout of the conversation that you just had. And so that is a great tool. I found myself using it and loving it. One of the things I'll say about Otter AI is that it struggles a little bit with accents. So don't freak out if you get a transcription and you're looking at it and you're like, what in the world is this? It does not like accents, but it is very good in a pinch, and you can definitely use it to sort of go back and refer to it for your interviews and actually see what the person was saying. We're going to talk more about this later in the webinar, but one of the things I also want to point out is I think everybody, sort of regardless of whether you're covering federal elections, whether you're covering state or local elections, you should get familiar with the FEC. You should get familiar with your state elections website, and you can get really familiar with how and where the candidates have to report their campaign finance information. If you're ever in need of stories in a pinch, those websites are a wealth of information. They can actually tell you a lot about the campaign. So I would just kind of say, as we start this, be flexible, be creative, and get crafty. And you're going to make your adjustments as they come, because we're living in really strange times, and a lot of what we used to be able to do, we're finding we can't. And so we have to adapt just like everybody else.
I had, if I may, I had one more transcription tool suggestion. There's a program called Verbatim as well. And unlike Otter, it's not live transcription, but you can upload audio to Verbatim and it will transcribe for you in a matter of a couple of minutes. So that's another option. And when you're doing interviews for Skype or using Skype and Zoom, another thing to keep in mind, if you're the person that's having to go back and edit too, you can always set up a camera as well if you have one, you know, for like an over the shoulder shot or one in front of you, so that you also create some cutaways for yourself and you're not just sticking on the head on of that Skype or of those Skype boxes. So that's just something else to keep in mind. And I see where we had a question here. I think we're supposed to answer those as we see them. And the question was, will Zoom and other digital technologies force the presidential candidates to take more questions from reporters who can't be physically on the trail right now? From my experience so far of the virtual press conferences that I've attended, I do think, because, you know, when you're in person, sometimes there's even like this physical differentiation between networks and local reporters. Well, on virtual press conferences, that doesn't exist anymore, right? There's no leveling of the placement on podiums or even, you know, on the press risers. So what I found is that it does seem that you have different campaigns and even the different state parties taking questions from a range of reporters, local and national, during virtual press conferences. And in sort of a way, I guess Zoom and Skype has opened that up a little bit more in a way that maybe it isn't always the case in person.
Yeah, I think that, you know, the technology platforms sort of offer a different way, a different form of access to candidates. It's a lot more intimate, I think, of a medium, as Lecrae was getting to. And so you have sort of different opportunities. Now, you'll probably still have times when the campaign is like, oh, we're done, bye. And obviously they'll hang up on you. That part has not changed. But I think that, you know, in working with it, it's fewer people, number one, usually behind them. They're usually sort of in maybe a closed space, or they don't have a lot of people with them. And so I think candidates may feel a little bit freer to say things that they may not have normally said, just given sort of the atmosphere that they're in. And so I think that, you know, you have to kind of listen out for those things and kind of think about, you know, how does the medium affect how the candidates are sort of interacting with it, and then by extension interacting with the people who are sort of joining them on it, because it is sort of an extra step that people have to take. So I think you have to also consider sort of who's logging on to get the access, right? The same group of people who may come to a convention or who may come to sort of an outdoor press conference maybe are not the same people who are going to be logging on to ask them questions in some of these technology spaces. So, you know, that's there. And I think there's, you know, some consideration that can be made for that too.
Go ahead, Darren. Did we lose you, Darren? Are you on mute?
Sorry, I was on mute. Keeping up with candidates is, I think, something that Lecrae was getting to talk a little bit about, but in terms of keeping up with them, I think one of the more crucial aspects of
I think Darren's might be having a little bit of internet issues.
candidates have appearances on either the news or they're making a comment on the day's news. So keep in contact with them the best way you can. Via media. This is a really good note, actually. This is now the main venue where they're going to attack their competitors, kiss up the party leaders, and share positions, thoughts on issues of the day. What you have to remember about COVID is that if you have new information or if you have a Nextdoor is actually also a really good resource for people who are telling their own stories inside communities, and also they are keeping data in specific communities about what's going on. So if you're covering a local candidate, you should be able to go back to some of these candidates with data, with information, with anecdotal stories about what's happening in the communities and be getting them to respond, because if they're trying to run for a constituency, that's obviously what they have to do, but they also have to be responsive to your questions. So make sure that your questions are backed up with the kind of data that doesn't allow them to duck you.
Did it switch? Oh.
As now. And I see where we had another question over on the side about do any of the transcription services translate from English to Spanish? In my experience, I know Verbatim, I believe Verbatim nor Otter does. Normally, I still just copy the text and put it into like a Google Translate or something if I needed to translate. But don't quote me on that. I just haven't used Otter or Verbatim to translate. So I'm not sure, actually. I haven't used it for that.
Yeah, I know Otter really struggles. I've actually seen some really cringeworthy things out of Otter when it's trying. Your point, though, to Google Translate, Google does an excellent job in translating. I mean, no software yet is perfect, but I think that if, in a pinch, you could use Google Translate to sort of get the gist of what someone is saying. So it's an excellent resource right there.
Right. For, using media tracking services. So one of the services that I use most is Kantar and CMAG. So if you just Google Kantar CMAG reporting tool, it should pop up. Now, I do know that you need an account with Kantar and CMAG, and the account that I use was created through my company. So it might be something that you might want to check with your boss about to see if maybe your company can negotiate prices with Kantar. I also don't know if Kantar CMAG does individual subscriptions for people who, are freelancers. But if they do, it's totally worth it, because this media tracking service allows you to look at different ad buys. And so it helps you to keep up with which PACs are fundraising for candidates, when they have ad buys scheduled for future months, and it can help you keep track of what was spent, before the current date. A couple of PACs to keep in mind, and these are a couple I looked up today that have done a lot of spending, since the beginning of last year. Priorities USA, they're a Democratic Party super PAC, and America First Action, which is a pro-Trump super PAC. So even if you don't have a tracking service that you're using, maybe knowing what some of the big PACs are can be helpful, because you can Google them and see what ads they've been putting out. A lot of times you can find those ads on YouTube from there. And so that's, the beauty of being able to track advertisement is you're able to see where candidates are spending their money, or where PACs are spending their money in terms of geography, but also in terms of the medium. So you're able to see if they're putting more money in Florida at a certain time of the year, or in South Carolina, if they're spending more money on digital nowadays because everyone's home, or if they're still putting out some TV ads. So media tracking services can be great, and they were great before COVID-19, and they're still great in terms of getting information now that we're in the middle of the pandemic. And for covering debates and town halls, so it's interesting because I feel like some aspects of that haven't changed. Normally, when you're at a rally, you're looking to see how many people are in attendance. You're looking to see whether they are engaged with what the candidate is saying. You're looking to see what the energy feels like and whether or not the candidate is making a connection. Well, on Zoom, you can't tell if a candidate is connecting with a person in person or physically, but you can absolutely still look at what people are putting in the comment section. What are they chatting about while this candidate is talking? You can see how many participants are in the Zoom chat. Or if that part is hidden, you can look and see how many views an event or virtual rally is getting on YouTube or through if they post it on their own website. Sometimes you can see how many people are watching at any given time. So you're still looking for some of the same elements, to be able to say this person had over 1,000 views while they were talking today. Another part, though, that has become a part of the editorial of covering virtual events is that whether or not a candidate is actually able to get their message across, because does their internet signal stay up? I covered a candidate's event a couple weeks ago, and it was there were technical difficulties all throughout, and just the nature of how we're reporting now, that becomes a part of the story. We couldn't hear 10 minutes of what candidate X was saying or candidate Y was saying because they went out. So I think those are things to keep in mind. But like I said, even in the midst of this, you're still looking for some of the same things. What is the energy like? How many people are paying attention? And what are some of the questions and comments that are being mentioned as that person is, giving speeches at their virtual rallies?
So this next piece talks a lot about mostly getting crafty in your reporting, right? You no longer have sort of the already staged events where there are people who are effectively a captive audience. Our current atmosphere sort of lends itself to finding stories off the beaten path. I work in public radio. We're extremely passionate about talking to what I call real humans, and not sort of the canned, put a mic in their face, talking head type thing. I think that when you get out into a community and you really start going to the local businesses, to the small mom and pops, to, the barbecue shop down the street, you really start getting a better idea of the issues that matter most to people. I encourage all of my reporters to be outside and somewhere all the time. If you're in the office, you're not doing it right. And so I say that, getting out and talking to people who you may not normally think to reach out to is extremely important. I think we saw during the last presidential election cycle, the polls got it wrong. Who were these, voters that were now voting for President Trump? It was a complete surprise to most politicians, but it wasn't a surprise to a lot of people who were really talking one-on-one with folks on the street. This is really important, and I strongly encourage people to sort of get out and break out of that comfort zone and really be reaching out to communities and to people who you might not normally be engaging with, sort of getting out of your social circle and finding other folks, because that's critical. As we have seen, again, in past election cycles and running up into current election cycles, these elections are won at the margins. I know we're going to talk about that a little later, but I want to introduce it here first because it's really, really, really important. If you have a candidate who has been sort of critical of a state response or of a local response, ask them what they would do better. To Darren's point that he talked about, don't be afraid to press people for information, and don't be afraid to press them for answers. A lot of times, a person will give a very vague answer, and that's not good enough. if you're going to criticize, how would you do it differently? What specifically would you change and how would you make it happen? These are unprecedented times. We've never gone through a pandemic. I live in Florida. I've been in hurricanes, never have gone through a pandemic. So I think, for a lot of people, this is a learning curve. Again, just as we're changing and adapting to how we're reporting, so are politicians changing and adapting their messages to reflect on COVID-19. And make no mistake, this will be an issue come November. You've seen governments take some really extraordinary actions that, raise constitutional questions about how far can governments go with respect to some of the lockdown policies that have been enacted. These are real questions that aren't going away. We're going to probably end up in another pandemic. How are we going to respond to that? How are you and your campaign, if you're a candidate, going to respond to that? I talked a little bit earlier about these campaign finance records. They can tell you a lot. They can tell you who's donating, how much are they donating, how frequently are they donating. They can give you a lot of information about a candidate and also whether they're viable, right? A candidate who has more money is likely a more viable candidate because it's also an indicator of how much support they have. One of the things that I found in some of my reporting from the last election cycle is that there was a local candidate who happened to have a tremendous amount of out-of-state money, right? Where is all of this out-of-state money coming from for a candidate, a local candidate who's running for mayor? So we did some digging. What were their connections? What did we find? Well, this candidate is really connected to a Washington, D.C. super PAC, and that's how he's getting all of this money. And so these are the kind of stories that you can tell just by simply going and looking at their campaign finance records and, following the money quite literally, because it can be really revealing. It can tell you a lot about how these campaigns are financed and who's paying for them. Kind of the last point is, and this is something that Lecrae also touched on a little earlier, is how spending has changed during the pandemic. So Lecrae mentioned sort of the cancer system and the CMAQ system. Campaigns are changing, right? Because I know for a fact that people listen to radio mostly in their car. Well, guess what? Everybody's staying home. So radio advertising has probably fallen because everyone is transitioning to either they're listening online, they're listening via streaming, and so the campaign money is going to go where the eyeballs are going or where the ears are going. And so sort of tracking that will tell you a lot more about how candidates are also tailoring their message and trying to find new audiences and trying to meet their audiences where they are.
And I just wanted to interject for those students who are on the call, on the webinar, you guys vote, students vote. Students, it's important for students to know the issues because you all have candidates at every single level of government that make decisions affecting funding for your school, or your local city commissioners and your mayors are making decisions that affect the city and how the city that you're located in treats the students who live there. And of course, at the federal level, you have federal policies and funding that affect schools, whether they're public or private universities. So it's, when you look at any level of elections, think about what decisions those candidates, if they're elected, will be making and how will that affect students. And that's how you can localize that coverage. And again, as much as you can, talk to your peers, even remotely. You all know how to get in touch with each other. Have other students talk about the candidates and the issues.
And to Tia's point, don't be afraid to dig. An excellent opportunity is, for example, here in Tallahassee, the poorest zip code in our area is the 32304. It's also the zip code with the highest population of college students. There are opportunities to get stories like that and cover stories like that and press the people who are running for office about, what are they going to do about situations like that? So you can find those stories sort of regardless of whether you're a working professional or whether you're a student. Get off campus, take 2 steps off of campus, throw a stick and find somebody. I was recently asked, I'm a student, how do I find stories? You find stories by asking questions. Question everything. Why is this the way it is? If you live in a college town, man, there's an awful lot of college student housing going up. Why is the rent so high? Asking these kind of questions about the situations and the circumstances around you are what open the door for stories, for in-depth stories that affect the people who, you as a student are trying to reach, which are other students, because you're not going to be the only one wondering about some of these things. 9 times out of 10, other people have wondered about it too.
Okay. I don't know why. There we go.
One of the slides that we had up before I talk about this one a little bit is about covering down ballot races. And speaking about money, a lot of these down ballot races now are having to figure out how to get creative digitally to still raise money to make their campaigns work. Because even though we're in a pandemic, campaigns still can't run without funds. And so what I've found, and I'm putting an example in the chat here, one of the stories that I've worked on during this time is how are some of the ways that down ballot candidates have had to really tread this line of being sensitive to people's financial situation in the middle of a pandemic, but also still making the necessary ask to keep their campaigns running. And so in terms of story ideas and things that can be interesting along those lines is, how are the down ballot candidates fundraising these days? In talking to people, I found out that people are doing things like Facebook Live cook-offs, where different voters can engage and tune in as they cook their favorite dish. People are doing Facebook Q&As or town halls, and especially down ballot candidates who were doctors during this time. They were able to get on and talk about what they were learning as it related to the coronavirus and answer questions that their neighbors and that their constituents may have. And also, I talked to a candidate who was organizing a local digital yoga meetup on Zoom. So you would pay whatever the money is and you'd get a link to a Zoom yoga session. So some of the creative ways that down ballot candidates have come up with to fundraising, it can be interesting story ideas too, because it has forced them to get really creative. In terms of, being safe when you're out reporting and you're finding these real people, I will say, Lynn just said, if you want to find good stories, throw a stone off of campus and get out. I will say during this pandemic, you get a little bit of a break because everyone's been inside. So you get to throw your stone on social media, which looks like putting out a post on Facebook, asking people in your area, hey, do you know anyone, any neighbors that have been impacted by this pandemic? Going to Facebook groups. There are Facebook groups for a lot of things these days. And so a lot of times it's a matter of going in and typing in Facebook group for, COVID-19, dealing with COVID-19, managing anxiety during COVID-19. And you can find people on social media platforms. So definitely don't be afraid to do that. The other thing I'd say is, obviously go back to your usual sources too. There are people that are dealing with this pandemic just like everyone else. I remember when things first started and the university started to close, some of my contacts in South Carolina at your HBCUs there, like Benedict and Allen, reached out to me to let me know that they were helping send kids home for free that couldn't afford to get home, even some of their international students. So don't forget to do your regular check-ins too during this time, because there are story ideas there as well. And on that same note, when you're checking in with your same sources, this second bullet that we have here just means make sure that you're not allowing being inside to limit the reach of the people that you reach out to. So, you know, if you go to the same political scientist at the same university, you know, switch it up, because you still want the variety of thought and the variety of opinion, even as we're going through and managing during this pandemic. And also, y'all don't forget to ask questions, because we have a section at the end for that. But obviously, if you think of stuff as we're talking, make sure you put it in the Q&A. Make sure you're putting it in the chat box on the side as well.
There we go.
Sorry, it's just going so crazy.
We can land on one.
Right. I don't know. Anyways, let's go here.
Here, Darren, do you want to take this one? I see you just got back.
Yeah. I had one note about the down ballot races and about really just candidates in general. But one of the things that people should be, I think, equipped to do on the fly is just to really keep a running timeline of things that are happening on your beat. So if you do that, if you have, like, you know, certain X candidate said this, then and really, if you even track everything they've ever even said about the coronavirus, at some point you're going to have a running list that you can use for your big feature or your breakout story. But you're not, it's going to waste your time if you got to go back and look at everything. So try to keep a timeline that you can always have, and let an editor know, hey, look, I'm keeping a timeline on this candidate. I think I want to do something on them in the future, because that can just be really useful in terms of helping you, honestly, to contextualize everything, because everything's just crazy. There's new news every day. But if you can come in with a strong line on a print or broadcast story that's like, it's been 8 weeks since, you know, X has happened, that's going to pull your reader in a lot more. For local reporters, I'm going to blank on something, but I read in a Biden story today that he's doing these these sort of in-town visits virtually. So he'll be focusing on a specific city or specific idea, so that he can talk about a specific place and talk about the people that he knows and things like that. Those are places that can be ripe with stories for you if you are paying attention to what the candidate is and isn't talking about. So if there's some big issue that happened in your state, and the campaign or Biden or whatever, they cover all of these things, but they don't cover this one particular topic, whether that's on your beat or something that you are interested in. Try and go call your activists, call local leaders to get their sense of what their impression of that is, because a lot of times what you'll find is that those candidates are more than those activists rather are more than interested in talking about the work that they do in the context of not having the ability always to meet in person, or to even really to use protest even as a way to help push candidates. So the last thing I'd say about this is obviously we've touched a little bit on the fundraising, but it really is such a huge thing for these candidates. They're candidates who aren't going on the air in states where they ordinarily would be now, because of that reason. And so try to be aware of that and the way that it affects the ability for the campaign to get their message out.
And if I could just add, another thing about talking to your, candidates who are running for some of these state house positions, they are eager to talk right now. You know, they
Yeah.
want to tell you that they're making local masks. I mean, they're making PPE and distributing masks to the local hospital. They want to tell you that they've been going to the local food bank and helping pass out food, because they're still campaigning. And you know, not to say that they're not doing this from the goodness of their heart, but I'm just saying that they're in a position now where they would love to talk to a student or anyone else for that matter about what they're doing in an effort to get that message out. And this is the same thing even when we're not in a pandemic in terms of localizing a story, right? The same way you take a big issue and make it relevant for your local community, you're still doing that now, whether it's what is the local. I worked on a story where we looked at a local Sleep Number factory, Sleep Number as in the mattress, the people who make beds. They were in a position to use their equipment to help refurbish masks, like thousands of masks that they were then able to distribute to some of the health, you know, some of the health organizations throughout their state in South Carolina. So, you know, you take a big issue like, are there enough masks going out to everyone, and, you know, PPE shortages, and you bring it down to your local city Sleep Number making masks for people. And so you're doing that same idea of localizing stories, even during this pandemic. The last thing I'll say is a way to find some of these candidates is a lot of the candidates, like Biden has been doing these service days of action on Saturdays. So you sign up for them, you get a link, and they'll bring supporters of his, but also candidates like, you know, the one that I talked to who, like I said, is distributing food at her local food bank, because they want to be able to tell other, you know, supporters of their candidate in this case, what they're doing. So doing some of those Saturday virtual days of action, those can be places to find characters too.
We spoke a little bit earlier, we have been speaking sort of about elections and finding the real people, finding the people behind the number, so to speak. So, you know, it's polling season right now. You've got polls coming out left and right that show X percent of X voters are now backing, you know, President Trump. X percent of X voters are now backing, you know, Vice President Joe Biden. So elections are won at the margins. We already know that if you can pick off a little bit here and a little bit of there, depending on the proper state, you can win an election. So the question becomes, well, who are the voters that insert candidate here are trying to pick off? Finding those people. For example, the Trump campaign has launched African American Voters for Trump. They are actively reaching out to the Black community because obviously they sense an opportunity there. So who are going to be those voters who are going to be inclined to sort of vote for President Trump? You can find them. They're out there. They're on social media. They are everywhere. Using this time to kind of find them and interview them and talk to them is a great service to your audience, to really sort of get at what about this candidate do you find appealing, why this particular person, regardless, you know, and the same is true for maybe Republicans who have grown disenchanted. They might be now ready and willing to sort of peel off. You can find them. These are the kind of really people stories and issues driven stories that I personally think really add context and get us outside of the whole kind of screaming match that become campaigns, really sort of zeroing on who are those people, what are their issues, and why, and trying to get at and really understand sort of the why and the reasoning behind a lot of these decisions. Obviously, we will still have political conventions. They might look a little different this year. Who knows? We don't yet know. But every state is going to have delegates. Your delegates are likely going to come from your state political parties and your local political parties, and they're going to be really easy to find. That's an email, you know, just to kind of reach out and say, hey, who are the delegates? Those delegates are going to want to probably talk to you. from the convention floor sometimes. As they're there, they're going to be willing, and kind of being able to kind of find them, hold on to them, and talk to them throughout about what's going on can also make for some really compelling stories. We had several delegates during the last presidential cycle that were basically our sort of go-tos for, hey, we heard this happened. You know, I saw this on C-SPAN. Can you tell me about what it was like when this was actually going down? And kind of being able to get those first-person stories and being able to kind of bring them back to your audience, I think really adds a little bit more oomph to the reporting on what would otherwise, you know, depending on what state you're in and what the convention is, kind of feel like, you know, why do I care what's happening up there? So just always be kind of looking and thinking about these sort of opportunities, because you don't have to attend these things in person to still get really good stories out of them.
And I was just going to also remember that at the political conventions, we mostly, like, the primetime speeches are what gets the most attention, you know, because you got the big name speeches every night, you know, but during the day, each state delegation is doing its own local programming, just like a regular convention. So again, if you're trying to localize the convention coverage, especially if it's virtual, find out what your state delegation schedule is, and they might have some speakers or some panels that they're pushing that is even that's interesting beyond the big speech that night. And also, panelists, we do have a couple of questions that came in. So the first one is, you know, DC is not a state, so some of these, like, state elections skips over DC. So for a DC-based reporter, what would you guys suggest as far as interviewing DC residents? Of course, DC residents are still voting for the president, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, but for these other, I guess, state races, what would you all suggest for interviewing DC residents?
Well, obviously, talk to the people in the wards that are being more affected by this virus, certainly more disproportionately than the rest of the city, and contextualize that in the context of what's happening with gentrification, what happened last summer, which was just a very newsy thing as it related to the changing of the city. I think in DC in particular, there is a sort of a movement that DC is being very adamant about in terms of mail-in balloting. So this kind of connects to another question that I saw in there about mail-in balloting. There's a big push now to get residents to do mail-in ballots, to apply for their mail-in ballots. There's a big fight on Twitter. I'm going to draw a blank on who it was, but I feel like there's just a fight broadly over mail-in ballots and the specter of voter fraud. That's going to be a big topic this year. The other thing I would say about mail-in balloting is pay attention to how the push to get more mail-in ballots affected Georgia. That's a really good test case for how it works. The Secretary of State actually, you know, pushed, I guess really to his credit, the ability for people to get more mail-in balloting. To pay attention to what folks like Stacey Abrams said, Georgia is going to be a real bellwether as it relates to mail-in balloting, and I think the states that do have extended mail-in balloting and that have extended early voting in particular are going to be really interesting. They're especially Pennsylvania, for instance, is a state that has, I believe, don't quote me on this, but about 6 or 8 weeks of early voting in the period before November. So that's going to be a huge thing, and the thing that people are going to be talking about a lot about an advantage for Democrats, but pay attention to how the Republicans try to oppose that too. That's where a lot of your news is going to be.
You know, as a quick follow-up to that, something that I have found that is emerging that I find really interesting is here in Florida, Republicans have really sort of led the charge for vote by mail balloting. But what we have found recently is that as criticism of vote by mail has amped up, Republicans have also sort of begun to not like it as much. And that's how they've been winning elections in this state, which has been via vote by mail. And so I think it's really important to kind of sort of watch the tone and the tenor around vote by mail and early voting and see how opinion is changing, because that's really going to start moving the needle on turnout. It's also really important to note that certain communities are highly suspicious of things like vote by mail and even early voting. African American communities in general are very suspicious of vote by mail. We'd much rather go physically be at the site where the ballot is going to end up as an extra level of security. And so watching these kind of opinions begin to shift as the tone of the campaigns has begun to shift is a good idea to just kind of keep track of sort of what's happening in your state.
And to just hit one last note on vote by mail, after we've covered over and over again to do it or to not to do it, which I think at some point you have to get outside of that. I think the important story too to look at is who this impacts and how. Which groups of vulnerable voters, like disabled people, like people who don't have access to postal services, end up being further disenfranchised if vote by mail isn't properly implemented. And activists will tell you that there are proper ways to implement it, but make sure that you don't get so caught up on to do it or not to do it, which is important because that gives you your differing thoughts and opinions on it, which are typically partisan, but how and who is it impacting if this isn't implemented well?
And Lecrae, can you quickly, we're getting a lot of questions and I want to get to as many as possible. Someone is asking, what advice do you have for packaging stories when you're doing interviews virtually? If you can give a quick answer to that.
Yep, very quickly. Like I said earlier, so sorry if this sounds repetitive. What I've been doing is I record the Skype interview, which gives you 2 double boxes that you can use from. So that's one shot. If I want to isolate it, I make it bigger on me. So that's a single ISO shot for me. And you can make it bigger on your subject. That's a single ISO shot for them. I set up a camera behind me so I can get an over the shoulder shot to cut to. And then if I don't have 2 cameras. So then I have to cheat that other camera. And after I've shot the over the shoulder, I put it in front of me too and get some, I ask the subject or the person that I'm interviewing, hey, can you wait a second while I switch my camera angle? Switch the camera angle and then get this shot on me too. And I've just been using my regular editing tools and then using those, those variety of shots to intercut the interview.
And we're going to quickly go through this, the last few slides and also get to the last questions.
Which slide do we have here?
This one on making your content, generating good content.
Yeah, I have a thought on this point that I thought, emulation is obviously really a key thing in our business. If you see a story or a trend that you see out there, don't be afraid to localize it. Use your reporting chops to put an angle on something that you saw and maybe you thought would be better done that way. We're in such a new thing, that new sort of era, that I don't think that all the times we realize how new so much of this stuff is when you're dealing with a novel virus. The other thing that I wanted to say about that too is that don't be afraid to have theories about what's going on based on your reporting. And so, politically, I think we, especially if you're covering a lot of Democrats and you're working on, sort of these big questions like turnout and voter suppression and things like that. I think what the coronavirus has given us the ability to do is to apply theories to what's going on and what's going to happen. And really, I think in terms of political theory, this is their job to like answer this question. And I think to Lecrae's earlier point, you're going to get a lot of people who do this work who, you know, don't usually talk to reporters. And so you're going to have some insight that, and really time to really get into the heads of the people who are the reason why these candidates run, and whether that's people who are looking at the changing demographics of states or cities or big counties. Look at how those trends can help you tell a story about what's going on in your state or your locale. But I think it's all about really just not being fearless, and being fearless and not being afraid to emulate some of the good work that you see, because the story's not going anywhere anytime soon.
So we do have questions. If you all want to go ahead and answer some of these questions, I will show the last two slides. They're kind of, we've already gotten to some of the issues in the last two slides about Election Day and voter access. So instead of focusing on the slides, everybody can read them, and let's answer some more of those questions in the chat.
Does someone want to handle this question? It says, would it be super helpful to pair up with someone who has a law background, degree, or a court reporter to go over some of these legal battles? Those are your best resources. Even think about, just to go super like meta for a second, the Supreme Court this summer was going to have a lot of different fights really on the court, that a lot of folks were thinking that we're going to be politicized in a really kind of at a breakneck speed. And I think what we're beginning to realize is that there is, you know, a lot of courts are actually being interrupted by what's happening. So I think that that's going to get you news there. Even if you're just talking on the local level in terms of like some of these elections and things like that, you're going to get a ton when you talk to people about how the courts are being impacted by this. And it's something that a lot of these people, again, aren't necessarily always talking about in a year, in a presidential year, but it's something that is going to matter a lot. So don't be afraid to really go after those trends.
And I was just going to say really quickly that what we've been doing, Meta, who asked the question about, you know, how to keep tab of all the legal battles. My team, we've been compiling all the different legal battles taking place in states. And as those states have had primaries, we then focus in on that particular state's legal battles. And, you know, for example, June 2nd is going to be another day coming up where you've got multiple states that have primaries. It might be helpful if you need, you know, sort of a guide to focus in on states, maybe look at the states that have primaries coming up then, seeing what legal battles are taking place there, and then going from there, because I know it can be overwhelming trying to keep tabs on what all 50 states are doing right now.
We have another question here from Henry. How could gentrification be better addressed to instill political engagement for voting day in heavily diverse cities and townships? I have a few thoughts on that. That would be a great opportunity to kind of look at how that area has changed from voter rolls. You can basically drill down and see, you know, what did this county look like 20 years ago versus what does it look like today in terms of population, and how much of that has been fueled by the issue of gentrification. You can tie those things together quite beautifully. The data is there. All you have to do is just kind of mine it. The states keep track of a lot of this. You have some independent people out there who are really heavy in sort of election data mining, who can also kind of help with this. But you can find those stories because gentrification is another issue, and I'm sorry we haven't really addressed it. But I think of sort of what do some of these historically democratic places begin to look like when neighborhoods sort of start beginning to change, or how, you know, maybe it was a rural area 20 years ago and it got a lot of industry and all of a sudden it sort of changed from maybe red to purple. Tracking those shifts, you can see them, and I think those lend themselves to excellent stories to kind of draw attention to the changes in moving patterns and how the changes in moving patterns and other sorts of development often drive changes in voting patterns as well.
I just sent an answer as well, but I'll say it now that we've got a few more minutes. It looks like, Jason, you were saying how else to add to a package during this time. And I realized I only repeated what I had said in the beginning, and your question was, what else? The other thing to keep in mind, which I just typed in the box as well, is let your Skype interview or your Zoom interview be a supplement to your piece. So, you know, if I'm writing something and I've already picked out some really great bites from an interviewee for the story, I might let, you know, something that they said, a novel thought or a different idea that maybe I didn't have the space for in my written work. I'll include that in the edit of the interview, because then it's not just a, you know, it's not a repeated version or a video version of what's written there, but it's actually supplemental, and it might give a different avenue or different angle. And so when you're, as a freelancer, giving that to your editor, you can then say, you know, here's the written piece, and in this supplemental interview, I was also able to cover this part of the story that didn't fit maybe into my word limit for the written piece.
And we have another question from Henry. How would you approach children being deported right now as a byproduct of the pandemic when it comes to candidates? And then a secondary question, which is, you know, covering the agenda for immigration, the wall, and et cetera. So really these kind of issues regarding, my internet connection is unstable, so I'm going to try and hang on a little longer for you guys. So basically, how do you go about, I guess, sort of reporting on these immigration issues in the midst of a pandemic? I would say, so I live in Florida. Obviously, this is a major issue in our state. And I live in, a lot of the times, you know, when it comes to Florida, a lot of attention is focused on South Florida, home of Miami, Belgrade, large immigrant populations. I live in North Florida, which is basically South Georgia, for those who don't know geographically. And immigration remains a big issue for us as well, because our area is dominated heavily by agriculture. And what I have found is when you start to begin to kind of tie some of these immigration issues to the local economies that immigrants support, it becomes a lot more nebulous. The feelings are not as strong as, say, as you would find in a state that doesn't have a large immigrant population. And so I think that when you sort of drill down and you start talking to immigrant families and, you know, industries like agriculture that employ large numbers of immigrants, you start to see that there's a lot more nuance regarding these conversations. And I think that, you know, bringing this into the fold is really important. I know that that's something we've really been focusing on here in Florida, and I think that, you know, it can move in other states as well, which is, you know, why should people be caring about these things? Why should a person care about somebody they don't know? And finding ways to sort of really bring those experiences home to people is critical. That's really what I would say to kind of that question.
I would piggyback on that and just say that if you can't get a candidate on something, tell whoever you need to tell that you are speaking to activists, because especially if the activists themselves are going to be in the story, because it's very easy for a lot of these candidates to not talk about stuff. As you brought up the immigration issue, it's easy to avoid, but I think that we have to put added pressure just because we don't have the same ability. So we have to get creative about it. So we have to make sure that they're accountable.
And sometimes a non-answer is an answer, you know? I feel like the same way when we're not in the middle of a pandemic, if we ask a hard-hitting question and it doesn't get a response, you know, that is that is the response. CBS News asked candidate X this about immigration, and, you know, this was the answer, or they didn't have an answer.
Yeah.
Those are
Any
great
more
questions.
guys? They gave us,
Thank you
NABJ
all
gave
for
us a
those.
little bit more time.
Is it okay?
Is it okay? Is it okay for candidates to not answer?
I mean, I prefer.
Yeah. I would say.
I think if you're the candidate.
I think, you know, we're serving as this conduit for voters, right? We're asking them questions that they maybe aren't able to ask in virtual press conferences and that they can't ask in press gaggles. You know, our job is to ask the question, and when you know the situation permits, to push on it if we feel like we didn't get a real answer. But, you know, I think that, and this is a Lecrae opinion, not CBS, you know, that when you are running for public office and you are saying you want to serve a group of people, that you do need to be able to answer those questions. You know, you do need to be able to answer questions that are impacting people's everyday lives.
At the same time,
This is
you
what
also
I
have
always
to-
tell.
Yeah, you can't like.
I'm saying what I always tell
like,
candidates. You're right. Right.
But
I always tell candidates it's my job to ask the questions, but we can't make them answer. You know, we can explain to them why it would be a good idea for them to answer. We can make sure we're clear on what story we're looking at and be very transparent about what our goal is that we're trying to accomplish. But we can't make anybody answer the question, but we also can be clear that we're going to report when they don't answer the question.
Exactly.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I see we have another, oh, go ahead, Darren, sorry.
I was going to say, sometimes you have to pick your battle. Like, if you want to pick a fight, sometimes you can pick a fight. Like, that's okay. But I don't think it has to be a sort of an either or. I think it's constantly something that you have to be thinking about as these people are less and less kind of accessible, but also a little bit more. So.
In a non-answer, I guess the last thing I'll say on this is, when a candidate has something to say about an issue, when they've talked about it with their team, when they've, you know, prepared their platform points, they're going to give that to you. If they don't give that to you, I think sometimes that can be indicative of how much time they've spent talking about this issue in their own circles. And so, not that I'm saying you should then go and sort of extrapolate necessarily, but I'm just saying that, you know, to your point, Henry, you know, sometimes a non-answer is more of an answer than you think, you know, because it could be indicative of how much thought has gone into that subject. We have another question in the Q&A box. What about dealing with local officials, leaders, and candidates who may have an issue talking to a reporter because of past issues with the station? How do you handle that?
I've been there a lot.
And I want to interject because I've been going through that right now. So you see my email address, the person who asked this question, email me so we can talk about this in depth because we don't have enough time. But I will say that it starts with building rapport. So it's hard to do that when you're out for a story. That this kind of rebuilding really takes time when you don't want anything but to try to rebuild. And you have to tell them, hey, this stuff that happened in the past, that didn't have nothing to do with me, bruh. So how can we move forward? How can I show you that I'm trying to build something and I don't want to be paying for something that I had nothing to do with? But sometimes it's a tactic to try to, it's an excuse. But again, please email me so we can talk more about this. And, but I would start with just telling that person to try to give you a chance, but you also have to put forth the effort to show them that you're trying to do things differently. And I always tell people, listen, I can't speak for what so-and-so did. I don't speak for them. Even at, they're a different reporter than me. I'm not going to throw my colleague under the bus, but I can't speak for what someone else did, but judge me on what I do.
Right.
I would agree with that.
Tia got a PhD in that one.
Listen,
So be sure to
y'all
email
don't
her,
know
like
the
she
struggle
said.
I've been-
Yeah.
And for that matter,
Well,
you can email all of us, and I see where Tia put our Twitter handles in there too. If you had questions that didn't get answered, or sorry, that you didn't ask here, because I think we answered all the questions, or if you think of anything when we log off, be sure to hit us up. I'm sure I speak for all of us when we say we're more than happy to answer questions from fellow journalists trying to figure this thing out like the rest of us. So, don't be a stranger.
For sure.
Yeah.
Yes.
I'll be around.
Ditto.
I'll be around on Twitter for another hour before my bedtime. So if anybody wants to reach out before 9 o'clock, shoot me a tweet, and I'll answer it to the best of my ability, guys.
Yes, and thank you guys so much. On behalf of the Political Task Force, I want to thank our panelists, Lecrae Mitchell, Darren Sands, Lynn Hatter. You guys are amazing. Thank you to everyone who joined our webinar. Please consider joining the Political Task Force. We're trying to bring support and programming. As we know, diversity in covering politics is very much needed. So, and again, as we said, hit us up. We are here to answer more questions. And thank you guys so much for a great webinar.
Awesome.
All right. Thank you. Tia. Thanks,
It's been a great
guys.
day.